Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Star Trek Enterprise Season 2. This video is part of a series of videos where I cover every episode of Star Trek Enterprise, one season at a time. For this video I will cover all the episodes of Season 2 of Star Trek Enterprise. So, those familiar with my channel will know that I have several times before stated that Star Trek Enterprise Season 2 is the worst season of the entire Star Trek franchise. So after watching this season just recently, very closely, like analyzing and paying close attention to each episode, I have two things to say about that. First thing is, the season's not quite as bad as I remember it being. And the second thing is, I totally stand by my stance that this is the worst season of the Star Trek franchise. Now, even though it's not quite as bad as I remember it, it's still quite bad. And comparatively speaking, I still think it is worse. Now, for me, it was kind of a close call. I had to think about this between Enterprise Season 2 and Voyager Season 3 and Next Generation Season 1. All three of those seasons are really close running for worst season of the franchise. But I think I had to give the slight edge to Enterprise Season 2 because, unlike those other shows, as I talked about in my Season 1 review of Enterprise, Enterprise is inherent, the whole structure, the whole foundation of the show and the characters is inherently flawed. It's inherently boring. Like Next Gen and even Voyager, I would say, have a cast of really interesting characters that can be done right in the right circumstance, where Enterprise, like, their cast is bland. Now, it's actually as I said, it's to the credit of the show writers in Season 3 and 4 that they actually managed to take this bland cast of characters and bland premise and do something interesting with it, which is to me the opposite of Next Gen, where the writers in Season 3 of Next Gen were just living up to the potential of this great situation. And I think first that goes a long way. Now, I think Enterprise, like Season 2, when I was watching it, like the first 4 or 5 episodes, I was just like, oh, this isn't that bad. I mean, these are just bland, boring episodes, but they're not terrible. And then I got into A Night in Sickbay. And from there, it was terrible episode after terrible episode after terrible episode. And I was like, I was blown away at how many garbage episodes they had in a row. But then later in the season, to the credit, they got back into, actually it got a bit better towards the end of the season. They had a string of okay episodes, like, oh yeah, that episode is pretty good, or that was okay. And then a couple of really great episodes towards the very end of the season, and then also 2 more really shitty episodes towards the end of the season, so it didn't recover entirely. So yeah, I think when I look at it, there's like 4, how I rate episodes 1 through 10. There's like 4 episodes I rated a 1, and I think like 5 I rated a 2. And I think that is the worst of any. I don't never remember it being that low for any season of Star Trek I reviewed. Even Season 3 of Voyager, as much as I like to crap on that. Because Season 3 of Voyager, I think, like, the first half of the season, except for Remember, which was an amazing episode, because it was the Next Generation script that they just repurposed for Voyager. That's probably why that was the exception. But the rest of Season 3 of Voyager was absolute shit for the first half of Season 3, but it got better in the second half. Well, the second half did have some terrible episodes too, but it had some really good ones, like Scorpion Part 2, which was in the top 10 of Voyager episodes. So I think that's definitely puts it above Enterprise Season 2. And although Enterprise Season 2 does have 1 or 2 really great episodes, and Next Gen Season 1 doesn't, I would still say as a whole, Season 2 of Enterprise is more of a failure than Season 1 of Next Gen. As I said, the inherentness of the show, like the characters are bland, flawed, and boring. But it's also, like I talked about in my Season 1 review, of how, and this is what everything I said about Season 1 is still true here, and sometimes, some ways even worse, about how the characters are incompetent when they shouldn't be, and I just don't buy it, and it's very frustrating and annoying. And it has this very confused tone. Like they don't know who the target audience is, because it just even more like plays on the whole sex appeal. And I get to those episodes when I get to it, where look at how sexy this is. And at the same time, it has this childlike feel to it, like from the 1950s. This is what I don't like. It has a really 1950s, like, Little House on the Prairie feel to it, particularly the characters. And this is why I think all the characters suck. They come off as bland 50s stereotypes. How they always watch movie night, and they always watch fucking movies from the 50s, 60s, or sometimes they want to really be edgy, the 70s. And it makes sense for the setting they have, because all the characters act like these 50s stereotype white bread, this is when America was great bullshit. And that's not what Star Trek is. That's not what Star Trek should be. And I don't like that kind of storytelling. I think it sucks. So it feeds into this season bad. So that's why I would say it's worse than next season 1 of Next Gen. And plus, like, on top of that, they just had so many terrible episodes in this season. But as I said, like, it's not altogether bad. Like, I wouldn't say this season is total garbage and there's no redeeming qualities. I wouldn't say that, because there are some redeeming qualities. As I said, there are a bunch of episodes that are okay, and there's 1 or 2 that are actually really good. But the bad definitely outweighs the good. Now, another thing I did want to get into briefly is how I said Enterprise, first 2 seasons of Enterprise were worse than Discovery. And as expected, I got a lot of people push back against that. A lot of people strongly disagree, which is not the least bit surprising to me. But I'm going to double down on that statement at watching the first 2 episodes of Enterprise. I do think they're much worse than Discovery. It's just my opinion, but it's just the way I see it. Because here's the thing, I don't think Discovery is perfect. I think there's a lot of flaws, particularly in the first season. There's a lot of production issues, a lot of things that get wrong, a lot of times that they're trying to be all actiony or too dark or whatever. But here's one of the major differences I found between Enterprise and Discovery is that when Enterprise tries to do something that's more sort of modern or action, or like something that appeals to a more general audience or wider audience, they actually succeed. Barring your opinion, maybe you think it has no place in Star Trek, it shouldn't be so action-based. Putting that aside, they actually do manage to appeal to a wider audience. They do manage to have very well-crafted action scenes that add to the tension, to the suspense. When Tilly says the F word, it makes sense for her character. Like this, it really actually irritated the fuck out of me. Say fuck when people had their panties in a bunch and made such a big deal about Tilly dropping the F-bomb. Oh no, she said fuck. Who fucking cares? The way people get so fucking pissed off of a word, just a word. Oh, it should be my Star Trek. But here's the thing, when Tilly drops the F-bomb, it actually works for her character. I buy it. It's believable in the way that she's been established, in the way that she uses the word. It sounds natural. It works. Whereas when Archer says ass, he sounds like a dad trying to be cool. Like every time they use violence or sex appeal or fucking profanity in Enterprise, it comes off as tryhards, as it doesn't fit, it doesn't work for the character, it seems out of place, it seems like it's just the networks pushing, oh look at how cool we are, where when Discovery does it, like it or not, it actually feels natural to the characters, it feels natural to the story. So to me that's the huge difference between Enterprise and Discovery. And again, like Discovery's not perfect. They do a lot of episodes, like especially season 2, the pacing's off. And in season 2, they went way too heavily on the fucking melodrama. But at least I know some people don't like the characters, but you got Burnham. You have regardless of whether or not you thought they used Burnham right, like the concept of her being a human raised by Vulcans, an interesting concept. The concept of Soru being this alien who has this extra sense of, he can sense fear, that's an interesting concept. Having Tilly be the young cadet, or just trying to learn, well, maybe that's a kind of tired concept, but she's a somewhat interesting character. And Stamets being this engineer scientist who studies and uses spores to create, that's an interesting concept. So they have interesting concept for the characters, whereas the Enterprise does not. The characters are bland. They're just archetypes, stereotypes of 1950s astronauts with no added character traits into it. So it comes from a worse position and plus what they do with the stories, like the episodes I'm about to get to, are much worse than the episodes in Discovery. I'm sorry, but there's no episodes that piss me off, irritate me, bore me, and make me want to yell and scream and be like, this is horrible. It actually seems like Discovery, not like Discovery, it seems like the writers are trying. Enterprise, a lot of these episodes, the writer, it really feels like they don't give a shit. They're not even trying. They're like, oh, we have to put out some Star Trek, let's just do it, blah, blah, blah. And here's another thing. Discovery stopped this policy that Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise were doing of only hiring writers who were not Star Trek fans. Which is, I always thought that was a stupid policy. It didn't really make sense. Next Gen Deep Space Nine actually worked out for them because they had really good writers who were good with what they work with Enterprise. I can really tell that none of the writers are Star Trek fans because they do not give a shit. They do not. Anyway, I know tons of people are still going to disagree. That's fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But I very strongly feel this way. The Enterprise is definitely, especially the first two seasons. Third, fourth season, that's a different story. Those are actually good because then you had writers who actually did like Star Trek, especially season 4, and you could tell. So I would say those are better than the first two seasons of Discovery. But when you're comparing the first two seasons of Discovery, the first two seasons of Enterprise, there's no fucking competition. Discovery blows it out of the water. But anyway, I know everyone's still going to disagree, but it's just my 2 cents. So anyway, let me just jump into this season now. Let me get into the season proper, starting with the first episode of Season 2, that is Shockwave Part 2. Now, I talked a little bit about this when I covered Shockwave Part 1. Part 2 was a huge disappointment because I actually really liked Shockwave Part 1. It was one of my favorite episodes of Season 1. But Part 2 was, I mean, it wasn't a terrible episode. It was okay, but to go from great to okay, where in a two-parter where the first part is great and the second part is that's fine, I guess. That's a huge disappointment. That's a huge downturn. And I do think, and I went back and I read this apparently since I've done my review of Season 1, that the writers had originally intended to reveal who Future Guy is in Part 2 of Shockwave. And even when I first saw this episode when it first aired on television, I got that vibe. And I still get that vibe when watching Part 1 of Shockwave, that they're setting up for this huge, epic, like, really getting into the Temporal Code War, like, revealing who Future Guy is, revealing all this shit that they've been teasing, really jumping into it and having this epic, like, future time-bending showdown, and I didn't do any of that. And yeah, the article I read said that I don't know why, but for some reason they decided to scrap their plans to reveal who Future Guy was, and so they just did this bland episode, which was just a typical aliens, in this case Suliban, hijack Enterprise, and they hold everyone captive, and they torture some people, and the crew has to band together to escape, and the future storyline with Archer is even more disappointing, because that's just him mulching around rubble, being like, oh, what is that book? It says Romulan Star Empire. and then making a time machine out of his communicator. Which is boring. Now, as I said, I don't think this is the worst episode ever. It was somewhat entertaining. But definitely, I think it's To me, it's really frustrating to watch this episode because I see this as a huge missed opportunity. I see part 1 and what they were setting up for and what part 2 could have been, and how season 2 as a whole could have been better, how they really could have delved into this temporal Cold War storyline, which I still think is the best aspect of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise. I know a lot of people disagree, so a lot of people actually fought back against this, said they hated the temporal Cold War storyline. It's not very good as is, I will grant you that, but I see a lot of potential for it to be good. It could have been much better than all the crap they did in season 2, but they went nowhere with it. I think it just demonstrates the lack of creativity and imagination in the writer's room and Enterprise at this time, or maybe some of the chaos. One other thing I want to say about this episode, another thing that really holds this episode back, is that it's probably one of the worst examples of the Vulcans being dicks. This is another huge detriment to the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, the way they treated the Vulcans, and the way Saval behaves in this episode is so obtuse. It is so out there. They're morons. They're not just portraying the Vulcans as assholes, as dickheads. They're portraying them as morons who have no sense of logic whatsoever, because Archer comes back with this hard proof that not only did they not kill all the people in the colony, but that they were set up by the Suliban. Obviously the Vulcans don't believe about the stuff from the future, so let's forget about that. They were set up by another alien, purposely, whose whole intentions was to discredit Enterprise so that their mission would be canceled. They have proof of this. And Saval's like, well, I think your mission should be canceled anyway. What? He's just being vindictive. He's being an asshole. He's being a dickhead. He's being obtuse. He's not using any logic here. And I think they had this contrived moment so they can have this moment where T'Pol sticks up for Enterprise, and Archer keeps saying, oh, I think you really put us over the top. Like, that was stupid. That really annoyed the shit out of me. The whole way the Vulcans were portrayed, this is so terrible. It's like one of the worst examples. Still a decent episode, though, but that really pissed me off. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Carbon Creek. Now, this episode, to be fair, a lot of people tend to like this episode a lot, but by memory, I always consider this one of the worst episodes of Enterprise. Like, whenever people brought it up, oh, what do you think of Carbon Creek? I'm like, that episode sucks. Which surprises some people, because as I said, some people really liked it. But I remember, like, really hating this episode. Now, I think this goes for pretty much most episodes of Enterprise, is that I saw them when it first aired, and then I binge watched the entire season, the entire show, in I want to say 2007, because there were a couple episodes I missed, and particularly with the later seasons, I didn't watch them in order, because it was around the time I had moved to New Zealand. At the time, New Zealand didn't really have it, but they were like a couple years behind on Enterprise, so I had to like download it, and the internet was a bit spotty in 2005 in New Zealand. So I watched season 3 and 4 pretty much all out of order, and but the first 2 seasons I was there every week watching it, which it's frustrating to me that when I was ready and willing to watch a Star Trek episode week to week, they gave us this crappy seasons, and when the show got good is when I wasn't available to watch it week to week. But oh well. But anyway, the point is, I'm getting up on a huge digression here. But the point is, I've only seen these episodes twice, and the last time was over 10 years ago. So I'm going many of these episodes, especially the terrible episodes, because believe it or not, I don't want to watch the terrible episodes again. So when I make videos like what are the 5 worst Enterprise episodes and stuff like that, in the past, I was going off of memory, because I didn't want to subject myself to this episode. So I remember the episodes being terrible. Now with this episode in particular, actually was surprised that it wasn't that bad. And actually, I think I might have even skipped this on my binge watch, because I really don't remember this episode. I think the only time I've seen it was first aired, and I just convinced myself that it sucked. But watching it again, it's okay. Like, I wouldn't go as far to say it's a good episode. So I still disagree with the people who would say this is a good episode and this is really interesting. But I wouldn't say it sucks either. It's kind of in the middle for me. It's fine, I guess. And I'll tell you why I know exactly why I remember it being terrible, and I know what exactly about this episode put me off, and that's, as I said, the 50s feel of it, because this takes that whole 50s blandness of Enterprise and makes it literal, because it actually takes place in the 50s, where it's T'Pol telling a story about her ancestor, who's played by the same actress, wouldn't you know it, and the 1950s where Vulcans land. And it has this idealized, that idealized version of the 50s where it's, oh gee whiz, let's go out and have fun in small town America, where it doesn't actually show any of the racism or any of the other issues in the 50s. It doesn't show the exploitation of the miners or anything like that, but no, let's have this idea, gee whiz, let's go out and whatever the idealized version of the 50s is. And that was very off-putting to me. So I'm pretty sure I saw that and I couldn't see anything else about the episode. And I'm like, this sucks. Also, it reminded me a lot of that Voyager episode. What was it called? 1159, where Janeway was just telling a story of her ancestor. See how familiar this is? And it was someone in the year 1999 who ended up falling in love with a guy who was like 5 times her age, and it was all about corporations are good. We've got to get rid of all the stubborn old people because of progress, because corporations are awesome. Anyway, that episode sucked, and I reviewed that on my channel and how I didn't like it. And this episode reminds me a lot of that, but I'll actually say this episode is better than 1159, because first of all, the framing device with T'Pol telling the story, with having dinner with Trip and Archer, as boring as it is, it does make more sense than the Voyager framing device, which was, oh, let's have our ancestor, like Neelix do our ancestor day, and let's celebrate our ancestors. And the whole Voyager part of that episode was really thrown in there and didn't make any sense, and it was really dumb. So at least here it's a nice little story. But I still think the concept of let's tell a story about my ancestor is a shitty concept for an episode, first of all. But it's funny, but the concept of Vulcans landing on Earth in what we think of contemporary times is actually an interesting concept. There was actually a novel, I think it was called Strangers in the Sky. I read it when I was a teenager, so I don't remember it all, about the original series, and I think it also was about Vulcans landing on Earth in I can't remember which decade, but in the 20th century. Pretty sure it was the 20th century, but anyway, contemporary time. Anyway, so it was a familiar concept, and I think maybe that's what people like. And the actual story about the Vulcans trying to interact with humans, that's what I found interesting. And I think the characters were actually kind of interesting. How you had T'Pol playing her ancestor, and if I didn't make it clear, I think the whole concept of having an actress play a character's ancestor, that's not how genetics work. They don't look your ancestors don't look exactly like you. So that always just annoys the fuck out of me when I see that trope. But anyway, the characters themselves, like the dude who actually ended up falling in love with a woman, and he wanted to stay on Earth. That was interesting, and how the Vulcans were trying to reconcile, try to interact with the humans, and not interfere with what this holds a primitive culture. So that, I think, was the upside, and I think that's why some people gravitate towards this episode. But for me, there's also too many downsides. Not just the whole 50s thing, but also I really hated the ending where, you know, Trip didn't, because T'Pol revealed that one of the Vulcans stayed behind, lived on Earth, and Trip didn't believe it. He's like, that's bullshit, we would have known about this, blah, blah, blah. You couldn't tell me a Vulcan's been living on Earth for over a century. And T'Pol's like, oh, yeah, you told me to tell you a story, so I told you a story. And like, oh, you made it all up. And they led it to believe that she made it all up. And then you see T'Pol go in her quarters, and she has like an item proving that it actually did happen, and that really annoyed the fuck out of me. I actually would have rather that T'Pol told what happened, because I want to know what happened to the Vulcan guy. What did he do in the past 100 years? How did he affect, like, what part of human history did he live in? Did he have any effect on it? Like, I wanted to know what happened to him. And because Vulcans have a long life, but I don't know if he'd still be alive. He probably wouldn't, but like, when did he die? Was he around? I don't think he'd be around Vulcans made first contact. But anyway, I wanted to know more about him and what happened. I wanted a nice little tie on the bow of the story, instead of this bullshit where she tries to play it off like she was just making it up when she wasn't. And that bothered me. That really, to me, it would have been a much better ending if they just fucking said what happened to the guy instead of, oh, I don't believe you. So anyway, yeah, as I said, this episode's not as terrible as I remember it being, but it's not that good. Anyway, let me get to the next episode, which is Minefield. And this episode was okay too, as I was saying. So this is kind of an interesting episode where they encounter the Romulans, and I think this is an interesting way to encounter the Romulans because they don't really see them in the view screen. Now, some people complain about continuity and canon or whatever, but here's the honest thing: as far as the Romulan history was established in the original series, that itself is not. Does not add up to later things that appear in the original series, let alone Next Generation. So it already contradicts itself. So it's impossible to stay within canon when the original series didn't even fucking stay in canon. Because they said that, I mean, the whole concept of the show Enterprising existing contradicts what they said in the Balance of Terror in the original series episode, because they said that the Romulans and humans fought a war using atomic weapons and before they had view screens, so they only had audio communication, which Enterprise already has view screens, which of course it should. They don't use atomic weapons, so it already is contradicted. So it's impossible to stay within canon. I'll just start with that. But I think they did the best to respect canon, though, because they did stay true to the fact that they don't see the Romulans or what they look like, so they don't know that they're Vulcanoids. Which is a big reveal in Balance of Terror. So if they did actually see a Romulan on the view screen, then that would undercut them, Kirk and all them not knowing what Romulans look like. So at least they stayed true to that, and I think that's good. And the episode itself was really interesting. This in Minefield, but really, it's kind of a novelty that it's Romulans. It could have been anyone. They could have made up an alien because. Yeah, I mean, I guess they have cloaking technology, but I suppose in the original series, cloaking technology was something the Federation never heard of, but of course that's already contradicted in Enterprise because Suliban have cloaking technology, so Archer even has a way to detect through cloaking technology. It was far beyond anything established in the original series times, but as I said, it's pretty much impossible to stay to that canon. But anyway, this episode was fine, I guess. I mean, I think the part with Archer trying to make friends with Harry Reid and Harry Reid... No, I keep calling him Harry Reid. That's a politician. Malcolm Reid. Malcolm Reid. Trying to, make friends with him And that was boring. I thought it wasn't terrible, but I wasn't interested in it and the whole argument. Because Archer was like trying to have casual conversation when he's disarming this mine, this bomb that's going to go off and destroy a ship. And Malcolm's like, is this the best time to be talking about this kind of shit, sir? And Archer's like, oh, it calms my nerves. You know what? I'm actually going to side with Reed on this one. You shouldn't be talking about what you want for what kind of food you like when you have a fucking bomb. You should just concentrate, or just, especially since he's not trained in how to disarm bombs. So maybe he should just shut his fucking trap and try to disarm the bomb. But, this episode was fairly interesting. It was fairly exciting. The concept, the whole premise of Reed being trapped on the edge, on the outer hull of the ship, and them having to deal with the bomb while the Romulans are threatening to blow up their ship if they don't leave. Like, all that was good, but it wasn't like super exciting. It wasn't bland. It was fine. Okay. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Anyway, let's move to the next episode, which is Dead Stop. And what I like most about this episode is that, and this is what the best thing I'll say about Enterprise Season 2 and 1, is that, in 2 in particular, and this is the episode that really showed it, is their sense of continuity. Because that's something that frustrated the hell out of me in Voyager, is that Voyager, Next Gen actually, they did it more naturally. Voyager, it was really unnatural the way they would do this, is that hit the reset button. Like at the end of every episode, things would the ship would be in peril, there would be damage, and there would be shuttles missing, and the very next episode, the ship perfectly fine, all the shuttles just magically reappear. Like, they just hit that reset button after every single episode and barely acknowledge the events of previous episodes. And I heard Brennan Braga in interviews defend that and defend episodic storytelling and saying that's what Star Trek should be, and that's the one thing he said that made me think that he has no fucking business being a showrunner of a Star Trek show, that he doesn't understand Star Trek if that is what he thinks. But and Brennan Rager was the showrunner for Voyager for the last years, but he's also the showrunner here. So I get the sense that he was overruled, thank God, by someone who actually saw. Because and here's the thing, though, because in Voyager times and Next Gen Deep Space Nine, episodic television was the thing. Because the only way you could watch these episodes were when they aired on TV or they aired on reruns, and sometimes people would just catch it. They wouldn't remember to catch it every week, so they might miss an episode here or there. So that's why serialized television was looked down upon, because it was hard to follow. You had to make sure to tune in every single week to know what's going on. If you missed a week, if you were working, or if you're out just going to a movie or whatever, like, unless you recorded it on your VCR, you would miss that episode. In the next week, if you missed it, if it was serialized, you would have no idea what the fuck just happened. Which is quite different than modern times, where you got streaming sites where all you have to do is click a button and see the previous episode, or you can TiVo it or whatever, and you can just watch them all in a row, and you just do the binge watching. So yeah, that's why shows in the 90s, that's why Voyager and whatnot were very much against the whole serialized storytelling aspect, because of the marketability. The way they could sell it is that they have to make it sure that anyone can tune in at any week at any time and get what's going on. But which is quite different in modern times, which is more common to just be able to go back and watch what you missed, or just watch the whole damn thing all at once. But Enterprise was in a transition time between that, because it came out in the early 2000s, where it was before the age of the binge watching, but it was around the time of the DVD collection set. So it actually made it more likely that people would watch the entire season all at once, because this was a big. That's what I was doing in this time period, was going to my local Blockbuster video store and renting, or sometimes if I liked the show enough I would buy it, but I'd rent like a whole DVD season, sit down and watch the entire season 1 week. So it was becoming more commonplace. It wasn't completely as kind of like set in stone like it is now. I talk about this a lot in my Lost reviews, which also came out in the early 2000s, about how that was a sort of a trailblazer, because that show was entirely serialized, and it had a lot of growing pains because they hadn't serialization like that was not as commonplace back then as it is now. So Enterprise is more of in that time period. So it was becoming. That's why it's not completely serialized, not yet. I'll get into that next month with season 3. But they were embracing that serialization tone a bit more, because there were shows like 24 was really big at the time. 24, each season was its own story, and that goes along with the whole DVD box set, medium there, where you'd rent a season, and one season would be one story, and the next season would be another story. So it's becoming more common. I think the studio heads or someone involved with the show who was above Brennan Brega's head was able to say, hey, we should throw in some sense of continuity. You did get this in season 1 a bit too, with the whole let's go to Ryza thing. They kept putting it off. But here, very long-winded way of saying, here in this episode, Dead Stop, it continues exactly after the Romulan Minefield. It doesn't be like the way Voyager would do it. The next episode would just not acknowledge any of the events of the previous episode. You just see Enterprise and it's fine, and they're going about the day, and Malcolm's fine, and everything's back to normal. Where here, they acknowledge the consequences of the minefield. There's like, the ship's totally damaged, we're fucked, we need repairs badly, we can't make it back to Earth, Malcolm's still recovering from his injury. Like, that's great. This is what I like most about season 1 and 2 of Enterprise, particularly when compared to shows like Voyager. Like, even Deep Space Nine has much as their praise for their serialization, which was mainly just in their last 2 seasons, and they do have a lot of continuity within the first 5, but there's also a lot of episodic stuff in Deep Space Nine as well, where they erase the events. The whole thing with O'Brien going through his like traumatic PTSD from being in prison, having 20 years of being in prison, putting his head in the very next episode he's fine, is to me the worst example of that. But so it's even Deep Space Nine, they still had that. So to see that Enterprise is not doing that they are embracing things that happen, have consequences, and they always, throughout the entire first 2 seasons, they're making references to things that happened before and showing the consequences of what those things have. Like the one time the Suliban took Archer prisoner or whatever. Like, I love that. That I think is definitely the high point of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, and of course this continuity gets even stronger in season 3 and 4, which are better. But this episode in particular, Dead Stop, like, as much as I love like the fact that they're acknowledging the events of the previous episode, it's actually kind of a boring episode. I thought it was a bit silly. I know what they're going for here. Maybe it's because I'm not a fan of horror, but they're going for like a haunted house type thing, where they had this spooky repair station. I will admit, some of the auto, because the station's completely automatic, and they had Blana Torres, who directed this episode. She was doing the voice of the of the computer, and the actress, of course, can't remember, Roxanne Dawson or whatever her name is. But anyway, that was kind of spooky, the way that, when Archer was yelling, he thought Mayweather got killed, so he was yelling at it and just saying, your inquiry is not recognized. Like, okay, that was a bit spooky, so it's not a terrible episode, it was fine, but I didn't think a lot of aspects of this were cheesy, and some of the spooky elements were just come off as a bit cheesy, rather than spooky. But then other aspects are interesting, and some of the aspects were actually kind of spooky. But overall, I think the whole concept of this being, especially, God, what really threw me over the edge of not liking this episode, although I would say it's okay, but what really bothered me was the ending. That where after, Archer destroyed the space station, you see it self-repairing. That's such like schlock 50s B-movie. The end, question mark, and the station repairs itself. It's just like, God damn it. That was stupid. But, as I said, some aspects of the episode itself were effectively creepy. But overall, it is also cheesy as well, elements, and the whole thing with the station being completely automatic, and they never explain what the station is, and it's all contrived writing to me, and how they just try to kidnap one person so they can have this supercomputer, like it's like a self-serving. But where did it come from? What does it want? Why does it want to repair ships? Like that's why is it repairing ships? It just seems like it's plot convenience because Enterprise needed repairing. So I don't know. A lot of issues with the episode, but a lot of things I liked, so it's okay. Anyway, let's move to the next episode, which is A Night in Sickbay. Here we are. I do think this episode deserves to be in my top 5 worst episode list. I will do one once I finish reviewing Enterprise on that. I can't guarantee this episode will be in that, especially because there's so many terrible episodes in these first 2 seasons. But I think this will be a very strong contender. I think I underestimated how much this episode sucked. Like, sometimes I say I watch an episode, it's like, oh, like Carbon Creek. Oh, it's not as bad as I remember. This is worse than I remember it being. Now, it's not like I had fond memories about this episode, but I think before I did my rewatch, I'd give it like a 4, but now I'm going to give it a 1. This is a terrible episode. So, it's all about Archer's dog getting sick and having to go to sickbay, so he has to spend the night in sickbay, and then he's having sexy dreams about T'Pol. And this is when they really start doing that. Like, season 2, this is the worst part of season 2, why I think season 2 is one of the worst seasons of the franchise. The way it keeps artificially ramping up this sex appeal of T'Pol, and having here you have the sexy dreams where Archer thinks he's making out with T'Pol, and they try to play it off like he's doing the Freudian slips with Lloyd Phlox calls it something different because he's the Nobun. And that's supposed to be funny, but it's not funny. It's stupid. And the way they had that decon chamber, and they had this sexy scene where Hoshi's like rubbing the dog, and then she and the dog leave, and it leaves Archer and T'Pol to sit there and make out. Of course, it's all just a dream, and it's got Phlox trying to. Why does Phlox keep trying to push his attraction, try to push Archer's attraction to T'Pol? It's so contrived. It's so obvious. This is such terrible attempts to say, oh, look at how sexy T'Pol is, and other than that, the aspect of it has these aliens who appeared very briefly in season 1 in the episode Vox Sola, where they were offended in that episode Vox Sola because I think they find eating in public offensive, which was a good like cultural trait. So the way those aliens were portrayed in Vox Sola was actually interesting. It was good. Here, they take it to a ludicrous extreme where they're offended by everything. And that wasn't the point of the aliens. The point of the aliens before was to show how cultural differences, and where some culture finds something normal and everyday, another culture may find it extremely offensive. But here, they totally destroy these aliens, and destroy that by having them be offended by every fucking thing. And then they're offended by the dog peeing on the tree. And I actually side with T'Pol on this one. Is why the fuck did Archer bring his dog to a first contact meeting with the aliens? Like, that was really, really dumb of him. And So Archer has to do this ridiculous ritual where he has to put on these funky things and chainsaw this tree and chant while he chainsaw it. So if there's this sacred tree that they offended them because the dog peed on it. So their solution to that is to tear down a tree. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it's just stupid. It was so ridiculous how they had to like do the chainsaw move. Oh, I'm doing this. It's a mockery. They made a mockery out of this show. All right, I'm done with this episode. Let me move on to the next episode, which is Marauders. Now I remember when this episode came out, I was delivering pizzas at the time. And I remember delivering it to someone's house when this episode was airing. Like, I think I was recording it so I could watch it when I got home. And someone's like, oh, I'm watching Enterprise at the moment, and they're taking on the Klingons. And I was like, oh, yeah. And I very clearly remember saying that to the guy I was delivering the pizza to, because I was feigning enthusiasm that didn't exist. Because I really was so disappointed with Enterprise. I was so uninterested, and I wanted to feel the excitement this guy was feeling at, oh, they're going to take on the Klingons this week, where to me it just looked a bit silly, and I got home and watched it, and sure enough, it was really goofy. Like, these are like stereotypical bullies. Here's a question I have for you. So this episode's all about like Archer training these guys to these, deuterium miners, where it's been well established a billion times that deuterium can be found anywhere, so they shouldn't have to mine it. But anyway, deuterium miners who are being terrorized by this group of Klingons who, demand all the yield, and it's basically held them hostage. It has the whole Western feel to it. And Archer, instead of coming in and just saving the day for them, they had to teach them how to fight off the Klingons themselves. Here's a question I got for you. Why didn't the Klingons just destroy them from orbit? Why is that not an option? Because obviously the Klingons would not be happy about getting their asses kicked. And it's for them to be like, oh, I can find deuterium anywhere, and they just leave. I don't think that's what would happen. I think the Klingons would be like, well, fuck you for defying us. We're just going to destroy your facility if we can't have it. Hate to be the dark cloud, but I honestly think their only solution was to kill the Klingons. Now, they're not going to do that because people will cry foul that that's not Star Trek, like that would not be very heroic. But in practicality, I don't see any way around it. I think the way they did do it actually was not how it would go. It was a fake, contrived way, because the Klingons would just destroy it from orbit, or if they had friends, they would return with even more ships. Also, Archer's whole point was in fending them off, where he says that whole saying about, oh, teach a man to fish, or give him a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he eats for a lifetime. I hate that fucking saying. It annoys. That's something my dad used to say to me, and so all the time when he was too fucking lazy to do something for me. Just fucking do it! But, so I hate that saying, and to hear Archer saying annoyed the hell out of me. Anyway, so that's also a real strike against the episode. But their whole point was that they would teach these guys to fend off the Klingons, and so that's why Enterprise just couldn't do it for them. But what they did in this episode, by like moving the whole town, I don't think these guys could do without Enterprise. Like, once Enterprise is gone, I don't think they can come up with something like that. They can have this huge tactical plan. Plus, Reed was there, like, shooting at them, and Paul was there doing her martial arts and kicking people's asses. So when the Klingons return with more people and the Enterprise is gone, they wouldn't have to Paul, they wouldn't have Reed, they wouldn't have this tactical plan. So whatever they came up with would be almost half as effective as what they did, and plus the Klingons would probably come back in greater numbers. So this is a terrible idea. I'm sorry, but the only way out of the situation was to kill the Klingons. that way they can't tell anyone about it and they can't come back. But of course that would be way too dark for Enterprise, and honestly I don't think that would be fitting with Star Trek, and that wouldn't be good storytelling. But in practical terms, that's the only practical way out of the situation. But I mean, this episode's not terrible. It's fine, I guess. It's somewhat interesting, the whole bully aspect, and some of the characters well developed, but yeah, it's not that good. Anyway, let's move over to the next episode, which is the 7th. This is a really, really boring, bland episode that I think was very poorly handled. I don't really know what they were going for in this episode. So this is about T'Pol, like she was hunting after these Vulcans who deserted and stayed in this primitive world or something, and they were corrupt or whatever. And she chased, she was sent to retrieve 6 of them, but she only got 5, so she gets the opportunity to go back and get the 6th one. And they talk about and then so she brings Archer and Mayweather, and when they get the guy, it's played by a really good actor, the dude from the X-Men, who actually did a great job in Voyager, but he's wasted in this shitty episode. Anyway, they get him, and he's saying that he's innocent, and he's just a family man, and he's not a smuggler, and he did this, the Vulcans are treating him cruelly. And then T'Pol starts to remember a 7th man that apparently she had killed and had her memory erased in. And all of this, and then you find out at the very end that the good dude was lying the whole time. He really is a smuggler and a bad guy. But all the thing about the 7th man, that seems to mean nothing. I mean, it just made T'Pol a bit disorientated. And this whole episode, the whole story structure of this episode is very sloppy. It was never interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say this is one of the worst episodes ever, but I don't really know, they didn't accomplish what they were trying to. I don't really know what they were going for. This episode is not good. Anyway, let me get to the next episode, which is The Communicator. This episode is even worse. See, now we're getting into the slew of really horrible episodes now. So we have been for a while, but this is it just goes on with these terrible episodes. So The Communicator is an interesting concept about Reed leaving his communicator behind on a primitive world that they're studying. And so they're worried about contaminating the culture. That's an interesting concept. They do nothing with that concept. All that happens is Reed and Archer go back to look for it, and they're taken prisoner by these asshole military guys who think that they're alien spies, and they find out, I mean, not alien spies, but spies from another nation. They find out they're aliens, so they freak out and they want to kill them. And T'Pol wants to intervene, but she can't do it without interfering too much, so she intervenes anyway, and they rescue them. It's amazing how many episodes in the first 2 seasons of Enterprise there are where a main crew member is taken prisoner and held prisoner for the episode, and that's the episode. That's and this won't be the last time we see this too, but this is probably the most generic example of that. They had nothing in this writer's room. There's something wrong with the writers. There must have been strife. Maybe there was complaints. Maybe they weren't even trying because they had contractual disputes or payment disputes. I don't know. They were unhappy, or maybe they just didn't want to be there. So most, I'll get to some episodes later where they just there's another story that did this. Let's just repeat it. I can't be bothered writing this. In this episode, let's just do another. Archer and someone gets held prisoner. Let's do that again. I don't care. Let's get this shit over with. That's what this episode comes out with. Shit. Anyway, let me move on to the next episode, which is Singularity. God, this episode is not just bland, boring, and unproductive. This is actively stupid. I hate this episode. So, I remember this episode clearly from when it was coming out. All right, first of all, I'm gonna address the elephant in the room right away. The thing I remember most about this episode, I think I would have to nominate this moment as the most cringe-worthy reference. You know how they do the references to older Trek or more established Trek, the ha 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 ha. This, Discovery does that a lot and it pisses me off. But I think this moment here is the worst moment. Worse than anything Discovery did of the is when Reed's trying to come up with his alarm to, if they're in a battle situation or whatever. And Tucker is like, I don't want to hear about your Reed alert. I groaned so much. I was like, get it? Reed alert. That's always what I think about when I think about this episode. Reed alert. Oh my God, that's the worst example of oh my fucking God, a Reed alert. And they don't even fucking call it a red alert eventually. They ended up calling it a tactical alert. And then for the rest of the show, they call it a tactical alert. What the fuck? Why not call it a red alert? Why not show... Obviously, this is meant to be the origins of the red alert, so why not... Who cares about the fucking red alert? Do we really need an origin story for a red alert, first of all? So just fucking call it a red alert. Why do you fucking call it a tactical alert for the rest of the day? It fucking annoys me every time they say tactical alert. I'm like, just say red alert! God damn it! Ugh! And the rest of this episode sucks. It's so frustrating because it's all about all the characters get obsessed with something, and because of the singularity, this is a really particular, specific singularity that has very like the Enterprise doesn't care. The writers don't care. They're like, oh, the singularity. Let's say it affects them, makes them obsessed with what they're doing. Like, what sense does that make? How would a singularity make people obsessed with the specific job they're going for? Like, that is makes no sense. It makes none. And Trip is obsessed with building the captain's chair. God damn it. Now, I gave this episode a 2 and not a 1. I think that is mostly because it has a so bad it's good quality to it. Because I do find enjoyment, entertainment out of this episode for being so stupid. And the actors are absolutely having a blast playing these obsessive compulsive versions of their characters, where Hoshi's like, I gotta get this cook recipe right, and Archer's like obsessing over this speech. But the way they play it off seriously, like they have Archer yelling at his dog, and that is like the big commercial break. Dun, dun, dun. Like, oh my God, this episode's terrible. Anyway, let me get in to the next episode. Oh my God, we're not gonna get out of this slump. Let's get into the next episode, which is Vanishing Point. Now, in my Enterprise top 5 worst episodes of the show that I did a few years back, this episode was in it as in the top 5 worst, and I can see why. I'm not sure if it still will be, but it's definitely a strong contender. Vanishing Point. I'm talking about Vanishing Point. And I had a couple people defend this episode and be like, oh, it's not that bad. And honestly, I couldn't speak to their defense of this episode because honestly, I couldn't remember it very well. I just remembered that it sucked. So watching it again, paying close attention, yes, this episode is terrible. So what I remember most about it is that Hoshi had the beam up, and then she was having these paranoid delusions that she was disappearing and people couldn't hear her, and that the transporters were racing her molecule. But big shock, it turned out it was all in her head, and it's so fucking obvious. Like, that is such a trope that's been done like a zillion times on Star Trek before, with like episodes like Remember Me, but actually this probably reminded me the most of Coda, which was also the Voyager episode, which is a terrible episode, and it reminds me most of that, where it's just like, oh, and what's the other one with Bashir and the Lethian, where he goes old? God, that one was terrible. What's it called? blanking on the, on the name at the moment, but Distant Voices, yeah, that episode was terrible. So it's in that same vein. This is something that's been done a zillion times, and it is not any better, and in fact arguably much worse in this episode, where Hoshi is like it's so frustrating. They try to play it off like it's creepy, like when people always fail to acknowledge her. Like even at the start of the episode, like they'll eventually go, "Oh, Hoshi, you're there," but they're kind of ignoring her, or to take a while to notice her. I was like, that's dumb. I'm sorry. I thought that was really stupid, and I'm personally like not interested in these transporter phobia stories. Like we did that with that Barkley episode in Next Gen, which was also absolutely terrible. And so we're doing it again, and we're doing the same trope, and we're adding nothing to it, and this adds nothing to Hoshi's character. She's not any more interesting, and nor do I know anything more about her. This stupid, oh, I'm afraid of the transporter. Like, from a perspective of a Star Trek fan that's been watching Star Trek for years, a transporter is common to us. Like, it's every day. It's a normal thing. I understand when in this era the Enterprise is set in that people wouldn't feel this way, but as the viewer, we feel this way, so we don't really care about someone who's like, oh no, the transporter. And of course it's all in her head. It takes place in a couple of seconds, and that was so fucking obvious when whenever they had like audio scenes where she could hear Trip in the distance. Oh, what is that? I mean, that's real life because you're in a dream. It was so fucking cliche. It was so fucking obvious. This episode is horrible. It is terrible. There's nothing good about it. Anyway, the Enterprise writers don't even care. They don't care. Anyway, let's get into the episode next, which is Precious Cargo. I called this in my last video I did the worst episode of Enterprise, and I am fairly sure I'm going to stick to that conclusion. Talking about not trying, like this, first off, this episode is just a replay ripoff of the original series episode, Eliana Troyes, which was a terrible episode to begin with. It was one of my least favorite episodes of the original series, sorry. And I'm just doing it again, but much worse. And the actress who played the character, the hot chick that Trip, who's like stuck up or whatever, that Trip has to interact with, is terrible in this episode. And like, it's not just Star Trek that's done this story before. This story's been done to death, like in a lot of like movies. Like there's that Overboard movie, or there's a couple other movies. You have a really rich, pampered woman who has to deal with a more commoner, brutish man, and they hate each other, and then they fall in love. It's such a cliche storyline, and it's absolutely terrible. It is cringeworthy. It is definitely not helped by the fact that I fucking hate Trip, and I think he's a moron. And to see him go, oh, Mr. Your Highness, and they get trapped in the planet, and they have this other side plot with these aliens who are trying to kidnap her, and they would push themselves off as freighter people. Like that storyline sucked too. It seemed really cheesy and not done particularly well. I didn't really buy it, but the storyline with Trip and oh my god, like when Trip and the woman kissed, I was just like, oh my god, it was not earned in the slides. There's zero chemistry between these characters. It was just a cliche by the numbers. Let's do the pampered rich woman makes out and falls in love with the commoner that she hates. Won't that be done? It's not like haven't already seen that a zillion billion fucking times before, and they do it in such a bland, uninspired. They don't care. The writers do not care, and even the director, the acting in this episode was terrible. Nobody fucking tried. It's horrible. I think this episode is a strong contender for one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Catwalk, which this episode's actually okay. It's not that bad. It's fairly interesting. It's got the dude, the boss from Fight Club, is playing an alien. And they come on board, and the Enterprise has to go through some gaseous cloud that's going to kill everyone. And that story's been done a billion times before, but I will say it is slightly more interesting here because they all have to, instead of just one person being awakened, they go to cryostasis, which is what they always do. They all go hide in the catwalk instead. And while they're there, these other aliens come who, the aliens that took on board were the same species, but they're like deserters because they're apparently there's evil military dudes who steal ships, and they come on, they try to steal Enterprise, and so everyone, they're trying to fire up the engines, which would kill everyone in the catwalk. So the people, they can't leave the catwalk for only short periods at a time because the gas will kill them. So they have to try to retake the ship, and so it was fairly exciting. So I actually liked this episode. I think that was I was suspenseful the whole time. It was a through storyline. It was great seeing Archer trying to take on these aliens and retake his ship, and the whole aspect of the catwalk, them being trapped there and having to be in this confined space and having that, like, the light. That was an effective tool to raise the tension in the episode where they're trying to turn the engines on, so they're in this small space and it starts getting brighter and hotter, and they're all about to get killed because they're turning on the engine. Like, that was really effective in ramping the tension. It was really a high tension stakes episode. But I wouldn't say it's like great or anything. Because again, this focused more on like movie night, and I fucking hate movie night. Why they watch? This is the whole 50s. Why are they watching movies from the 50s and 60s? And so they act like they're in the fucking 50s, and then like 200 years in the future, they won't be cramming behind this tiny little screen watching fucking Frankenstein or whatever the fuck they're watching. Nobody does that now. God damn it. But the rest of the episode is interesting, so this episode is actually pretty good. Anyway, get into the next episode, which is Dawn. Alright, so now, I liked this episode better the first time I saw it when it was called Enemy Mind. And I liked this episode better the second time I saw it when it was the Next Generation episode called The Enemy. And I most definitely loved this episode much better the third time I saw it when it was called Darmok. Fourth time I saw it when it was called Dawn, it sucks. I put this, this is another episode I put in my top 5 worst Enterprise episodes, but I'm not sure this episode would quite make it this time because there are some smidgen of redeeming qualities about this episode, like the interactions of Trip and the alien. I just find somewhat entertaining, interesting on the play. Somewhat, just a little smidgen. But the way, like, the plot is basic. It's just Enemy Mind. It's the enemy. It's the Next Generation episode, The Enemy, with LaForge and Romulan on the planet, and they hate each other, they're enemies, and they're fighting, and they have to work together. If you ever heard of the movie Enemy Mind, it came out in 1985 with Dennis Quaid, and he's a human fighter, and he lands on a planet with the alien, they hate each other, and they have to learn to work together. It's that. It is that. It's been done a zillion times before. This is what I'm saying. Now, I have other videos when I talked about how certain episodes of shows would just rip off other shows. Like, I talked about this with The Orville. I talked about this in my season 1 of Enterprise and definitely season 2 of Enterprise. And I talked a little bit about this in Babylon 5, and I got some pushback. Of course, there's a lot of people who are huge, like, obsessive fanboys of Babylon 5. And I got pushback there because they said, well, everything is based off of everything. You can look at any story, any movie, and say found roots in previous stories. Which I find that argument kind of similar to the anti-climate change argument, the deniers, the climate change deniers argument, where they say, yeah, but the climate has always been changing. It's been changing, since the dawn of the planet. It constantly goes through cycles, which is true. But also irrelevant, because this is a specific time where the climate is not supposed to change this way. It's actually supposed to be getting cooler, but it's a human activity that's affecting it. So yeah, the climate constantly changes. It gets hotter. It's been hotter before than what it's getting now, but that's totally irrelevant because this is a different situation. If you actually analyze and look at the situation, it doesn't actually fit into the perceptive mold. So I would say the same thing about the whole thing about, yes, every story can take elements of previous stories, but you have to look at it. Is it this just another example of that, or is it taking too hard, leaning too heavily on previous material to the point where it's just fucking doing the same thing over again? And that's definitely, and that's the case with those Babylon 5 examples, and it's definitely the fucking case here, where, yeah, sure, every story borrows from everything that influences, but they do it and they make it something original and something that has a new, fresh feel to it. If they just do it and they make it worse, and add nothing to it, and it's too similar to it where it just seems like they're repeating the same damn thing over again, then you get this fucking episode, which adds nothing to this trope. It's just the writers have no effort. They put no fucking effort. They're just like, oh, I like that episode, The Enemy, but it was a rip-off of Enemy Mine. Oh, who cares? Let's just do it. Let's just do it again. Have Trip, who's annoying as fuck, on this planet with this stupid alien, and then they have to go, Trip, and then they hate each other, they get in the fight, and all of a sudden they're best friends. They didn't even progress their friendship together. It's like, we're getting in the fight, and now we're buddies, I love you, all of a sudden, this episode sucks! Sorry. You should know this is going to happen when I'm reviewing Enterprise. Anyway, let's get to the next episode, which is Stigma. Now, some people love this episode or really like it. Now, a lot of times when I did a video like a year ago, I think, about the LGBT representation in Star Trek, and I did a lot of research for that video, and pretty much all the videos, articles I read mention this episode, and most of them would mention it ahead of the Deep Space Nine episode Rejoin, which is the episode my video focused on, because I thought a lot of these other videos I watched neglected that episode, which I actually think is the most important Star Trek from previous to this decade representation of LGBT in Star Trek. So I think that's the episode people should go to first, where the episode they go to first tends to be The Outcast, which I think is a very bad example, and the episode they go to second tends to be this one, which, I mean, it's more of an AIDS analogy than an LGBT analogy, but it's about how the AIDS epidemic affected the gay community in the 80s. I'm not sure why, because this episode was made over a decade after this issue was extremely relevant, so they're a bit late to the party here, but let's excuse that for the moment. It is a good analogy. It reminds me a lot of the movie Philadelphia, but not too similar, as I was just saying about the previous episode. This would be another the example I'm talking about where they borrow, but not too heavily, so it's okay. But here's what I talked when I did my video about the LGBT representation in Star Trek. I said how I didn't like to put this episode in that group, and I don't think this was a good episode to use for that example, because it's not a good episode, because it tries to cram this analogy into a situation that doesn't fit. And what I'm talking about in particular is this is probably one of the worst episodes in terms of the Vulcans being dickheads. Because the Vulcans are totally obtuse in this episode. This is not in character for them at all. I know that even Enterprise has been playing them as assholes, which is something I absolutely hated. They take it to a real height here, where it just doesn't work. It just doesn't make sense why why the Vulcans, they're just discriminating. Oh, people, and it's too obvious of an analogy, first of all, that the people committing mind melds or immoral and they should be outcast from society. It's too clunky of an analogy. I don't think it works, and the Vulcans are completely out of character. They're total assholes. To T'Pol, they want to ruin her career just because she contracted this disease, which I get the analogy, and it is a real life thing, but it doesn't work in this situation because the Vulcans don't behave this way. And Archer calls them out. It's like, oh, you Vulcans call us primitive, but we don't hold a candle to you when it comes to bigotry. And in this particular situation, Archer is 100% right, but he shouldn't be. And that goes against the very nature of the Vulcans and how they've been portrayed. But leaving that aside, that aspect of this episode does really annoy me, but I would still say this is a decent episode. It was powerful, the message that they were trying to get across, and I think the actors do a good job, particularly T'Pol's actor. She does a good job in this episode portraying the situation. I love how T'Pol refused to say that she was forced. And that's how she got the mind meld, because she thought it was irrelevant. She thought it was the discrimination that was relevant, so it shouldn't matter whether she was forced or not. I think that spoke very highly to her character, although it doesn't fit in the culture of the Vulcans. It shouldn't have to do that, but I still like that. So this was a decent episode. I wouldn't say it was great, but it was okay. So move on to the next episode, which is Ceasefire, and this episode is fine. This episode's fine. It's got Jeffrey Combs as Shran, and he's always good. Shran's always good. Yeah, they do some negotiations with the Vulcans, and Shran calls in Archer, and Saval's a dick to Archer because he doesn't think he thinks he's a stupid human. But then they get in a fight because Shran's first officer is betraying him. Oh, what a shock. That shocked a bunch of idiots, but no one else. So obvious she was betraying him. She tries to kill Archer and Saval, and Shran finds out and catches her, and that's the end of it. So it's fine. I mean, there's not much to it. I do like how Saval actually starts to like Archer and appreciate him a bit in this episode. So it becomes a bit less of a dick. This will get better in seasons to come, but this is laying the groundwork for that. He wasn't the complete, total, obtuse moron that he was in Shockwave Part 2, which really annoyed me. So there's that, and of course, as I said, Jeffrey Combs always great as Shran. It's fine. It's fine. Anyway, let's move to the next episode, which is Future Tense. This episode reminds me a lot, and I'm not saying as in a copying way, but just for me personally, it reminds me a lot of the Next Generation episode Time Squared. It's a totally different plot, I mean, except that they both have time travel elements in it, but that's where the similarities end as far as the outright plot. But to me, it has that same feel to it. Now, with Time Squared, and that's the Next Generation episode where Picard encounters a future version of himself who's kind of catatonic. Now, that episode kind of liked, but kind of didn't, because it feels like there was something there. There was a dark tone that was there, but they didn't really do as much as they could, and so it feels kind of lacking. And that's how I would say with Future Tense, because it's an interesting concept. They encounter this ship from the future. It's like has all these weird properties. Like you can go in, it's tiny, but you go inside, it's much bigger inside than it's outside. Show writers said this is something they always wanted to do, and I think that's an interesting concept. They never explain how it worked. They just say, "Oh, it's futuristic, beyond your level of comprehension," which I actually like. I think that's cool. And then they introduced. This is the first time we see Tholians. Since the original series, they've been name dropped like a shit ton of times since Next Gen. I know we don't actually see the Tholians in person, but we see their ships and we hear their communication. And I love how they handle it. I love how they do the the universal translator, because in the original series, of course, they just had a high pitch, "We are the Tholians," but I love how they handle the Enterprise, where you hear these squeaks and you hear like this computer flat voice translating the squeak, saying, "You are in inner space." And that was cool. It brought us some level of ominous to the Tholians, and they didn't do their web. I think that would have been a bit fan servicey, which we'll get in season 4, which is all about saying fan service, that episode they appear in, but that's good. I don't mind it there, but I'm glad they didn't use it here. I think it's cool that the Tholians aren't, because the web wouldn't really be appropriate in this situation. Although they could have used the web on the Vulcan ship, now that I'm thinking about it, but oh well. Anyway, because that was really cool, because the Enterprise was like running away from the Suliban and trying to hide the ship, and then the Tholian, and we have to get to the Vulcan ship. This is something the Enterprise has been doing a lot in the first 2 seasons, which is kind of like, it shows how it's the only Starfleet vessel out there. So when they need help, they need to turn to the Vulcans. So there's a lot of times where they have something and they're running. I think it was this way in Shockwave as well, where they're running from someone and they gotta get to the Vulcan ship. And that's always their destination. Once we're there, we'll be safe. It's all good, but we need to get to that Vulcan ship. But here, they were doing the same trope, and they subverted it, which I loved, because they're like, we gotta get to the Vulcan ship. How close are we going to the Vulcan ship? They get to the Vulcan ship, and it's fucking in flames, and it's disabled, and there's a bunch of Tholians around the Vulcan ship who now converge on Enterprise. That was great. I love that. And the fact that the Tholians and the Suliban started fighting each other, and apparently the Suliban were no match for the Tholians. This is all cool. But it seems like this episode didn't have as much substance. It had that sort of X-Files feel to it that a lot of these temporal Cold War episodes do. And by that I mean, like, it feels like the X-Files, if you ever watched it, a huge fan of it, a lot of the episodes, especially the mythology-heavy episodes, a lot of stuff happens, but it seems like nothing actually happens. It's hard to describe. It's like, you get into fights, they go into missions, like a lot of events, a lot of incidents happen, but at the end, when you look at the plot of the whole, you don't really learn any information. It's like, everything's still a mystery. And that's, sometimes that worked with the X-Files, but I talked about how Enterprise did this in season 1, but it doesn't work for Enterprise. Like, X-Files pulled it off, but with Enterprise, like, why are you trying to be like the X-Files? It just doesn't work, and it did that a bit in season 1, and they do it again here in this episode, where I feel like this one is, you don't even see Daniels. They didn't even get Silic for this episode. They were too lazy to get Silic. They just have some generic Suliban chasing, and so it doesn't really seem connected. You never learn what the deal with the future ship is, or who the future guy was, or why they get it, and it didn't have any impact on the Temporal Cold War or any of the storyline going. It was just, they had this cool thing that other aliens were chasing after them. And so the thing could have been anything. Could have been a future ship, could have been a past ship, could have been a pot of gold, could have been anything that these aliens are chasing after. Because they didn't really get into any of the substance of it. So it's a good episode. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed it. It was suspenseful, but it's not great. It's just, it's there. It's okay. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Canamar. Now, for some reason, Enterprise wanted to do Con Air. Why did I give this episode is worse? It's not a 6, it's a 4. I'm just checking my notes here, sorry. Why did I give this a 6? It's a 4. Anyway, yeah, they wanted to do Con Air, basically. And it's just so boring how they're just like, it has to say, Enterprise always has these wrongfully accused, these captured, 2 members of the crew get captured by some dickhead aliens who are authoritarian or just obtuse or stupid. Like, there's only 2 seasons in, and they've done the storyline a billion times. Although this episode does give a slight spin on it, because they're found innocent immediately, which is not usual. Usually, they're never found innocent, they have to escape. But here, they're found innocent, but they get trapped on this prison transport, because the prisoners take over, hence the Con Air storyline, which, I'm sorry, but, I like Scott Bakula and all, but he is no Nick Cage. I will say that. It was kind of boring. It was kind of by the numbers. It was a by the numbers bland version of Con Air without any of the sort of cheesiness or intrigue or, excitement that Con Air has. It's just like, oh, there's some aliens that want to take over the ship. And, I totally didn't buy the interaction. Archer trying to pretend to be a smuggler was just cringy. I'm sorry, Archer, you are a dork, a dad-type dork through and through. When you try to be this badass, you just come off as a dad-type dork trying to be a badass. You don't come off as a badass, you come off as someone who's a dork trying to be a badass. So, I don't know. I don't really. It has a dude it has Donnie Darko's dad playing the alien cop. That's why. Hey, it's Donnie Darko's dad. Anyway, yeah, whatever. Let's move on to the next episode. So the next episode is The Crossing, which, again, this is another one that it's fine. It's fine. This huge, gigantic-ass alien ship takes Enterprise in, and these, wisps of, energy take over the bodies of the crew. We haven't seen this in Star Trek a billion times before, but that being said, it's not a particularly bad version of it. It's not a particularly boring version of it. It's passable. It's kind of exciting when they start taking over the crew, and again, this catwalk makes another appearance in Season 2, where they have to go hide in the catwalk because of the little energy thingies can't get in there. So it was got kind of suspenseful there. And Phlox was immune, but all the half of the crew, or not half, but a sizable chunk have been taken over these things, so they try to attack Phlox and stop him, and everyone else is trapped in the catwalk. They can't leave. It was exciting. It was interesting, but not much to it. Again, it's kind of cliche done, not much originality to it, so it's fine. Move on to the next episode, which is Judgment. Now, I actually do really like this episode. It's a Klingon episode where they do the whole trial, so it's very reminiscent of the Undiscovered Country. They even go to Roar Penthe at the end of the episode. So it was leaning very heavily on that Undiscovered Country nostalgia. I don't have that big of an issue with that, though. And the episode itself was interesting, the whole Archer being the trial. I love the format of the episode where you start with trial on Archer on trial, and then you go back and you see the events that led it, and you do it through the perspective. They did this also in this Deep Space Nine episode, Rules of Engagement, which I hated that episode because I thought it was cheesy. Here, I think is actually a better version of that. I will actually say, Enterprise being better than Deep Space Nine can happen. But anyway, yeah. So you get the story, you get Duras, which I think is kind of dumb. I mean, it's obvious we're meant to believe this is an ancestor of Duras who just happens to have the same name. I think can they be a little bit more original than that? I mean, that's a bit dumb, but whatever. Duras goes on, and he gives, of course he's an asshole because the whole family of Duras are assholes, I guess. It's a family of assholes. But anyway, he, gives his version of events of what happened. So you see, Archer going death to the Empire. That's cool. I like that. I like that perspective. And then later on in the episode, you get the what really happened when you get Archer's perspective of how Duras was just being I don't know if I really like the way Klingons are portrayed in Enterprise. Don't get me wrong, nowhere near as bad as what they're doing to the Vulcans, but the Klingons come up as really obtuse assholes, and they want to be assholes for the sake of being assholes, and they're very obtuse about what's actually happening. Of course, that's what happens where these refugees are dying because the Klingon Empire abandoned them and won't give them any resources, so they go out looking for resources, and Klingon is just they're rebels, let's kill them. And Archer helps them, whatever. So I thought it was cool, I guess, but the whole storyline with Martok, we have the actor who plays Martok plays Archer's lawyer. I don't know if I like the whole thing where they talk about this greater. I mean, it kind of makes sense because of how the Klingons are so dumb now. He was saying they weren't always that way. That before they become corrupt, and he tries to call out the judge for being such a corrupt asshole, and he gets thrown into prison with Archer, and then when Archer gets freed, he elects to stay. Now, Roy Penthe, I gotta say, it must have really is renowned as this like death trap of a prison where if you go there, you're gonna die within a year. But they must have really shitty security because the 2 times it was featured, the people who were prisoners escaped quite easily. I mean, I suppose in the Undiscovered Country say it wasn't easy for Kirk and McCoy. They almost died. They had to go in the freezing cold or whatever. But still, all Spock had to do was slap a transmitter on Kirk's back, and it stayed through that process of the trial, through the process of the being processed in prison, and it's still fucking there. And here, all they had to do is read into Paul. All they had to do is bribe some like transport that's going there, and all they could do is go there and here you go, Archer. Like they had no security in the prison. It's a bit pathetic of a prison if you ask me. So this episode's fine too. I mean, it's good, but it's fine. Anyway, let's move over to the next episode, which is Horizon. Another episode that's fine. I mean, this is kind of a bland episode. It's a retread of what they did in season 1 with Fortunate Son, where you had you explored Mayweather's past as a freighter, boomer or whatever they call him. Not baby boomer, just a boomer who, people who lived on freights, humans who did the freighter things. And, see, Fortunate Son, they encountered a different freighter where they're, the guy's being an asshole to Mayweather, and how could you abandon your family and your freighter? And he's like, look, my family's okay with this. In this episode, we find out his family's not okay with it. And they said his father wasn't okay with it, although Archer reveals that the father wrote a letter recommending him, so he finds out he actually was okay with it, even though he didn't think he was. But his brother's not okay with it. He's being a dick. Why, how dare you leave and go to Starfleet? We already did this. But the thing is, this is better than Fortunate Son because at least it deals with Mayweather's family. But why didn't they just fucking do that in the first place? And here they're just like, we did this, but we should have done it with Mayweather's family. Let's do it with his family this time. Let's do the episode again, but this time with his family. Although the actual plot was a bit different because it was about, slightly different because it also deals with pirates attacking freighters, but instead of like the freighter guy being a dick and making things worse, they have a situation where the freighter captain actually wants to just run and hide, where the solution is to confront them. So that was the spin on it, but it's basically the same damn thing. And then you get the side plot. Oh god. Actually, I'm going to give this episode a 5. I was going to say 6, but I just remember the side plot. The side plot just knocks it down to a 5. It had to do with Archer and Trip trying to get to Paul to watch movie night. And this is when they do Frankenstein. Oh my god. Fuck movie night. It makes no sense for them to be watching movies from the 40s and 50s. 300, 200 years in the future on the starship in space. Because they're all act like they're from the 50s. God damn it. I honestly, I feel much better about Discovery listening to pop music from the 2010s than I do from the Enterprise crew watching movies from the 1950s. Because at least that's a century more recent. Anyway, sorry. Let's get into the next episode, which is The Breach. This episode's fine. It's okay, I guess. This is another one. They have what happened? Oh yeah, Trip and Reed and Mayweather go to this planet where they're kicking out all the aliens, all off-worlders. There's some Denoblians underground in a cave, so they have to go caving. to get to them, and when they get there, their dicks don't want to leave, so they have to like yell at them and get them to leave, and there's like caves are gonna collapse, and we gotta create some tension or whatever. I mean, that was somewhat interesting, it was somewhat engaging, and the side plot has to do with a rip-off of Detrell, where Phlox encounters this guy who hates him because the Noblins and him his species hated each other, and he has to convince him to treat him when he doesn't want to be treated. And that was okay too, but it's kind of, we've seen that before, much better with Detrell. This was kind of fine. This episode's fine. It's very forgettable. Like, before I watched it again for this rewatch, like, I couldn't, if you asked me what happened in this episode, I could not tell you. I remember some Denoblins being underground and them being dicks to Trip, not wanting to go back, but that's about it. That was the extent of my memory of this episode. So when I watched it, I was like, oh yeah, it's this dude who acts like he hates Phlox because he's Denoblian, and then there's other aliens that have to get out of the hole, have to go caving, whatever. Very forgettable. I'm probably not going to remember it in a couple of years. But it's not a terrible episode. It's fine. Anyway, move over to the next episode, which is Cogenitor. So, I did a full-length review for this episode. And I called this episode, in that review, I called it the best episode of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise. And after watching the first 2 seasons of Enterprise again, I stand by that statement. I think this is a great episode. It's funny because there's 2 other good episodes of Season 2, or great episodes, which I'm about to get into really shortly. But those episodes feel more like what's to come in the next season. They have more of a Season 3 feeling to it. Like, it feels like the previews of what Enterprise is going to become. Whereas this episode feels very much like a Season 1, Season 2 episode of Enterprise. It has that same feeling of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, except good. Except it's done really well. Now, this episode, if you don't remember, is when I love how they encounter these aliens, by the way, who are actually friends. Because almost every time Enterprise they encounter these aliens, they turn out to be deceptive, hiding something, or outright hostile. Where very few times, I guess because it doesn't make interesting television, do they encounter some aliens that are actually just... I mean, I know there's a couple. People bring up, like, Unexpected or Expected, whatever that episode's called, and then there's another one, I don't know, the Great Plume Vagasauria one. That one was boring, but so it does happen, but not very often. So I love it when it happens, and I love that they crafted a very interesting story out of that concept of, here's some nice aliens that get along great with Voyager, but here's a very interesting story within that. I think that's great. Now, this is about like a cogenitor. It's a species who have 3 genders, but the male and females are like the main gender. The third gender is kind of treated like a subclass, like, because there's not very many of them, so they just kind of use them as property and shuffle them around whenever a couple wants to have a baby, because it's required for them to breed. So and since there's less of them, they sort of on short supplies, so they have to like put it in an order. They have to be on a waiting list to get one. Once they get one, they can have a child. It's kind of like, it reminds me of like the whole adopting thing, how you have to go on this huge waiting list for it. But Trip sees the way that this Cogenitor is being treated, and how they're being treated as how she, I guess, Trip calls her she, because it's played by a female actor. So, for the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to it as a she, because it doesn't seem right. But anyway, so Trip sees the way that she's being treated, and so starts to educate her, and starts to tell her that she could be more than she is, and he does brain scans that shows that she's just as capable as the other genders of their species, and this of course creates a rift, because when they find out that Trip's doing this, they get pissed off because that's not the way they're supposed to be treated. So then she asks for asylum to go to Enterprise to escape, so she can, lead a normal life and be educated and do all the things, listen to music that she's not allowed to do. And the other aliens, of course, are very much against this, because they the couple wants to breed, and they think that the Enterprise is interfering with their culture, and they don't understand their culture. And so Archer has the decision to make: should he grant asylum? And he decides not to, and sends the Cogenitor back, and she's not happy with this and commits suicide. So Archer brings Trip in and yells at him and says it's his fault for interfering in a culture he didn't understand. Now, I think this is a very powerful episode because it's very complex. It doesn't... A lot of the, social commentary episodes of Star Trek tend to have a very black and white, preachy sort of aspect, you might say. And some of them actually appreciate. Sometimes I think it is necessary to have a preachy aspect, or I really appreciate it. But it's also cool sometimes to look at issues from a more of a abstract way, or more of like a complexity, like presenting the issues but not really hitting you over the head with a particular message or a particular way, so you can interpret it in multiple ways. And I think this brings up the and this is an issue that I think fits well into Enterprise, because they're out exploring and meeting different aliens with different cultures. So it explores how different cultures interact with one another and what it means to respect or interfere with another culture. Now, I did a full-length review of this episode, and I got more into the controversy of this episode, which I won't get too much into here, because you just go watch my full-length review for more details. But basically what it boils down to is a lot of people hated this episode because they felt like it was using the excuse of cultural diversity in order to excuse discrimination. In particular, they make the modern day analogy to some Middle Eastern cultures that discriminate against women, and so some people drew the conclusion that this episode is saying it's okay for them to discriminate against women because it's within their culture to do so, and if other cultures try to interfere, they're wrong because they don't understand their culture. But I don't think that's a correct interpretation of this episode. I don't think that's what this episode is saying at all. I don't think it's trying to excuse discrimination at all and trying to say, well, it's just a different culture, so they're allowed to do it. I think it's talking about the complexity of trying to address issues like that in a different culture, that you have to handle it wisely and first understand the context of the culture you're dealing with. It's not excusing that discrimination. I don't think this episode is at all trying to excuse the discrimination that the cogenitors face. In fact, I think the episode very clearly is saying that the cogenitors are being discriminated against, and very clearly is saying that is not a good thing. But what it is also saying is that the way Trip handled the situation was not wise, and this was totally in Trip's character. In fact, in my review, I talked about how this is the one time when Trip, being such a moron, actually worked for the show, for the good storytelling, because it's totally like he would come foolhardy, treat it the way he would treat any other humans, like, oh, this is wrong, so I'm going to interfere, and I'm going to teach her, and I'm going to do this stuff. Where I'm not saying, he's not wrong to feel sympathy for her, and he's not wrong to want to do something about it, but he's wrong in what he does, in the foolhardy way he goes about it. That's a hell of a lot more complex situation than that, especially with the strange alien culture they just met, they're just befriending, and they don't have any formal relations with them, and he's not really thinking it in long-term complex terms. And I think that part of the episode worked perfectly. And now some people also argue that Archer was at fault for not granting the asylum, but I talked about in my full-length review how you have to understand this is before the Federation exists. This is when Starfleet is at its infancy. They're the only Starfleet ship out there. There's no governmental process to handle asylum. Like if this was in Next Gen time, they probably would grant asylum because there's all that framework is there to exist to grant someone from a different society asylum, but it does not exist at this point. And Archer's just one ship alone out there trying to do his best, and so I think he was right, honestly, to not grant asylum. And so I think he was right that it was Trip was to blame for interfering in the way that he did. Maybe the episode could have done a better job making it clear that Trip wasn't in the wrong for feeling sympathy, but I think it was pretty clear on that point. But I think the acting in this episode was great, like the way it portrayed like the relationship between Trip and the Cogenitor. It was very engaging, and you had the scenes with the guy from Babylon 5 who played Jakar, playing the alien who was out on the ship with Archer. Like that, all that was done like very well. So I think this is, and as I said, this had a very strong season 1, season 2 feel to it. Except it was actually really good. Like to me, this episode represents what season 1 and 2 of Enterprise should have been. And it should have been more episodes like this that had complex situations with complex characters, with good acting, good drama, where it all adds up into a great story. So I love this episode, and yeah, I stand by this is the best episode of the first 2 seasons. So let me get into the next episode, which is Regeneration. Now, I'm surprised. This is actually another great episode, and I'm surprised to be saying that, because this episode in particular does not feel like a season 2 episode. Like when I watch this out of context, like it's hard for me to imagine that this is in season 2 of Enterprise, because it doesn't have that blandness feeling of this is an effective, creepy episode. Now, I, like most people, when they first heard the concept of Enterprise doing a Borg episode, assumed it would suck, because Voyager killed the Borg to death. They overdid the Borg so much where they were no longer interesting, so it seemed like it's just a cash grab, attention grabbing thing for Enterprise to do the Borg, and it makes no sense for the Borg to be in this time period, because they're like far superior to Enterprise D in Next Generation time. So the Enterprise in this would just be like a bug to the Borg. But the way they actually incorporated it makes total sense for what they established in Enterprise. It makes total sense for the time period, and of course, it makes total sense why the Enterprise is actually compatible, or not just a bug compared to the Borg, because they're dealing with 22nd century technology. Because it has its continuation off of First Contact. It makes sense in the continuity of First Contact. Well, kind of, because in First Contact they just destroyed the Borg ship. There's no indication there were ever any survivors who crashed in the Arctic, but whatever. We'll suspend disbelief for that. But the fact that they take over this tiny little transport, which is shitty, but they start to modify it to make it a bit more compatible. At first it's just 1.5, but then they modify it to make it go warp 3, and then they started modifying the weapons because these tiny little. So they start to improve. It shows how advanced the Borg are, but they're dealing with more primitive technology. So at first so that explains why they're below the level of Enterprise, but they start to advance and become even more. So eventually they become more than a match of Enterprise. So it's like almost as another ticking clock element to it, that the Archer needs to deal with them before they become more advanced in Enterprise and then just kick their ass. So that it worked a lot for the episode, and plus the fact they never said the word Borg in this episode, so it makes sense that they don't know who the Borg are in the 23rd, 24th century. Unlike Voyager, it doesn't fuck with the Q-Who timeline. But there was that thing at the end where Archer said, "Oh, this and that means they'll be back in the 24th century." That was dumb. I'll agree with that. But the majority of the episodes I actually put this in my top 10 Borg episodes. And I stand by that. I think it is better than a lot of the Voyager episodes. It actually works. It is effectively creepy, effectively scary. No point does it feel goofy like most Enterprise episode does. It feels like everything, all these tense moments, were totally and completely earned. Maybe the part in the Arctic maybe seems a bit much of a cliche horror movie where the scientists are being a bit obtuse and being like, "Oh, what is this?" And to the creepy, scary cybernetic life form. It's like, yeah, but other than that, like, especially the scenes in the Enterprise with Phlox and how he's infected with the Borg and he tries to like fight it off at the same time because he underestimates it at first and then he's like, I'm not underestimating this again, and how like they think they can help. This is something I don't think they dealt with enough in Star Trek, is that they think they can help the crew members or the humans and the Tarkalians that were infected or assimilated. They think they can help them, and it's Archer coming to terms with the fact that he can't help them, which was actually, if you look at it, a nice foreshadowing of what he has to go through in season 3. So this is, I was more shocked than anyone that this actually turned up, because I thought the concept of a Borg Enterprise episode was dumb and would suck just like the Ferengi one did. But the Ferengi one, that didn't fit at all. It made no sense why the Ferengi there. It was just a shameless callback, where here they actually made it fit into the continuity of Enterprise, into the canon of Enterprise, to actually make complete and total sense and actually be a very exciting, like the way that this is one of the most scary, effectively scary and creepy uses of the Borg in the entire Star Trek franchise. Really surprised me. So this is actually a really great episode. Okay, so then we get to the next episode, which is First Flight. I don't like this episode. It was even worse when the rewatch. Some people really like this one. I've seen it get high ratings. Brennan Braga seemed to love it, and because he saw it as an homage to astronauts. And honestly, I don't like when he does homages to astronauts in Star Trek. I don't think Star Trek's the right place for it. I mean, you might be like, oh, that's stupid, Mark, because it's about space and takes place in space, so they should honor astronauts. Okay, yeah, no, sure. Absolutely, I'm all good for it, but don't devote a whole episode for it. And this in particular, I don't think it honors astronauts. I think it's not very good. And I actually thought it was cringeworthy how much they went out of the way to make it look like NASA. Like in particular when Archer and his AJ, whatever, were doing the test flight, the spacesuits they were in looked exactly like NASA spacesuits, and I was just like, I roll. I'm sorry, but this is Star Trek. Anyway, I think. I know, I hear a lot of people like, I have nothing against astronauts. I like, movies that are about the astronauts, and I think it's absolutely great to honor, the strengths that they did, but I don't think Star Trek is the right place to do it, and I don't think Star Trek does it well. I think Star Trek has nothing to do with it, and it's just I just don't like when Brennan Braga does episodes like these. And this one in particular, I was cringeworthy. I thought it was absolutely horrible. First of all, they create this character out of nowhere that always annoys the hell out of me when, Trip and Archer are like, oh my god, did you hear AJ died? Oh my god, I can't believe AJ. Who the fuck is AJ? Why do we care? We don't care. We've never seen him before. Now they have some flashbacks. But really, why it bugs me is because even though it's plausible that Trip and Archer they know each other for a long time, so it's perfectly plausible they knew someone that was not shown on the show. But the way that it's done, since we know this is a television show, and the way that it's done with no hide or hair or mention of this guy, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, he's our best friend, and let's have this memorial for him, and then he's never mentioned again after this episode, by the way. It comes off as fake writing. It comes off as contrived. It comes off as what it is. They're just making this character up on the spot just so they can do this episode. That's what it is. It's blatantly obvious, and it comes off that way. And the episode itself, first of all, T'Pol, the framing device sucks. It's T'Pol and Archer going on the shuttle to do so. Look at some anomaly bullshit that doesn't mean anything. It's so boring. And then this time they have Archer tell a story. We already had an episode where we have someone telling a story, which I think is not a very interesting episode. But this one is even worse because it's so contrived. And plus, like Paul kept saying, I'd never heard of this event before this incident. I had read nothing about it. I didn't read anything. If this AJ guy was so fucking important, Why didn't you know about him? And then, like, T'Pol, Archer talked about how they stole this ship, and T'Pol's like, oh, it's funny we hadn't heard that, and Archer's like, well, that's not something I want to publish. Starfleet wants to publicize. She's like, well, I hadn't heard anything about that from the Vulcans. And I was like, well, but the Vulcans were there. They knew that Archer stole the ship. So why the fuck wouldn't the Vulcans? You think the Vulcans would really publicize this and really show it up? Look, these humans aren't ready. They're stealing ships. It makes no sense that T'Pol never heard of it. And then, and just the whole storyline was such a contrived, oh, they're going to scrap the program, so we're going to steal the ship and prove that it goes warp 2, and it was just so contrived, the whole thing. And it's the storyline we've seen like a billion times before. It was so bland. The AJ actor I recognized, he was on Dexter. He played this detective guy, but he was not particularly good in this episode. I gotta say, I like nothing against him personally, but that character was so bland. I didn't buy his relationship with Archer. I didn't buy their, rivalry or whatever. I didn't buy Archer in this episode at all in the past. I didn't buy that he was like just the interactions he had with them and how they always went to the bar to hang out in between, and they got in a bar fight. Ooh, that bar fight was such an artificial, fake way to create tension in this episode. It was so artificial and fake, I couldn't stand it. And it's just a whole, like, tension in this episode. Everything felt fake and artificial, like the whole stealing the ship and, oh, we're going to prove the Vulcans wrong, and again, the Vulcans are being dicks for no reason. I don't like this episode. I don't like it at all. I think it sucks, and I don't like it. Sorry. Anyway, let me get to the next episode, which is Bounty. Now, this episode surprised me because when I think about this episode in the past, I always think, oh, this is a bounty hunter. It's a Tellarite bounty hunter, which I think is a cool idea. So I was like, oh, so that's a decent episode because it's got this bounty hunter, the Klingons won Archer, which again, I like the continuity where they don't just forget about his escaping a Klingon prison, because let's be honest, most Star Trek shows would. Most Star Trek shows, the character escapes prison, that's it. We never hear about it again. But it makes sense that the people who own that prison he escaped from would want him back and would try to get him back. Although, to be fair, this is kind of forgotten after Season 2. I don't know. I'll have to wait till I see Season 4. They might bring it up. I think they mention it, but they never really try actively to recapture him again. But anyway, I don't know if they throw an excuse as Season 4. Maybe they do, because Season 4 is much better. But anyway, so when I think about this episode, I think, oh yeah, so that's a decent episode. But when I actually go back, as I say, I sit down, analyze this episode, and really think about it, I realize this episode actually sucks. I wanted to like this episode because I like the idea of having a Tellarite bounty hunter trying to capture Archer to take him to the Klingons. But, alright, first thing, it's not the only plot. That's only half the episode. There's actually two plots that I would argue take up equal amount of time in the episode, and the other one is horrid. But let me get back to that one later. Let me focus on the Archer stuff first. So, the Archer storyline, actually, when I look at it, is not that good, because the character of the Tellarite, I like the idea of seeing the Tellarite, which I believe this is the first time we've seen him on Enterprise. But he's a very two-dimensional, childish character. It reminds me a lot of the Voyager episode Renaissance Man, which I hated because it had those bubbly, whatchamacallit, hierarchy dudes who, and one of them was like, they did the same thing in Acquisition with the Ferengis too, where they have like the lead bad guy and they have the henchman sort of like a dumb idiot, and hopefully they'll let me do this, and the lead bad guy treats him like shit, so our hero manipulates the underling, but like, oh well, he just not treating you right. If you help me, I'll treat you right and give you the respect you deserve. It's such a cartoonish, flat, two-dimensional, unimaginative storyline. Now, they don't exactly do that here, because the Tellarite doesn't have like a boss above him per se, but he is doing this because he owes the Klingons money. And we find out that the Klingons do treat him like shit, and all he wants to do is get his ship back. And so Archer tries to play the whole, oh, well, why are you going to help the Klingons? Eventually he does. Eventually Archer turns the guy to his side by saying the Klingons screwed you, they destroyed your ship, so why are you going to help them? So it is very similar. It is essentially that, even though it's not the exact same thing as like Acquisition or Renaissance Man, where there's a henchman and a lead bad guy. But it's essentially that, where our hero manipulates the guy because and this guy is kind of naive and dumb and just like, oh, I want to get my ship. And he did remind me a lot of that character from Renaissance Man. So that's really dumb. It annoys me. Again, this is like the writers do not even try. I don't think they respect Star Trek. I'm going to be fair. I think Brannon Braga in particular does not respect Star Trek. I think the writers of some of these episodes that he's in, who write shit like this, and not just this episode, but a lot of these episodes in season 2 I was talking about that just rip off other stories and stuff that came before it, or they just like put in a lazy attempt at an episode. I don't think they give a shit about Star Trek. I don't think they respect Star Trek. I think that they just see this as another show they can make a quick buck on by just doing the bare minimum and just write there's the cliche here, let's just write that and get this over with. That's what I think. Not all the episodes, obviously, but a majority of these season 2 episodes, this one in particular, as I said, it's a good idea, but it seems like that's all they have. A good idea, and they just fill in this good idea with a cliche, boring bullshit. And a horrible subplot, which I'll get into now. So, the subplot, I just talked about how Enterprise has great continuity. And then we get this, which totally spits in the face of its own continuity. I'm not talking about the larger Star Trek continuity. I'm talking about Enterprise's own continuity. And what I'm referring to in particular is Dr. Phlox. Because in this episode, again, God, this subplot is so terrible. It brought down the whole episode to me at least 3 points. Like, I probably would have given this episode a 5 if it was just the Archer stuff, because that annoyed me, but it was okay. But when I considered the subplot, I had to bring it down to at least a 2. I mean, the Archer thing keeps it from getting a 1 because it's not that terrible, but definitely a 2, because this subplot is awful. First off, it has we're gonna be all sexy, and it ramps it up to like a 12, where it has T'Pol is like going through Pung Far, which do Vulcan females? I thought it was just men who went through Pung Far, but whatever, who cares? So she's going through Pung Far, so she's like trying to have sex with everyone, and she's scantily clothed, and she's like trying to seduce men, and she's talking about, oh, you've been wanting to get in my pants for a long time. They can't lay off the sex appeal with T'Pol. They just can't. I imagine it's the studio heads being like, we need T'Pol sexy, T'Pol sexy, T'Pol sexy. We have to keep reminding, let's bank off of this. They want to see boobs. They want to see tits. Come on, have T'Pol try to have sex with everyone. Come on, do it! And it's so fucking stupid. Now, getting back to what I said about the continuity issue with Phlox. Phlox in this episode says that Denoblian men are very squeamish about their bodies and about sexual encounters, and even more so than humans. And you see him like very nervous about taking off his clothes in front of T'Pol, and when T'Pol has to rub the stuff in the body, he's just like that goes against everything established about Phlox and his character. You go back to the episode, I don't know if I mentioned it when I talked, I can't remember what episode it's from, but there's one episode where there's a subplot, I forgot to mention it, where Phlox's wife comes on board and she's hitting on Trip. That was dumb, by the way. Anyway, Phlox's wife comes on board and she's hitting on Trip the whole time, and Trip is like, oh, do I tell Phlox? And eventually he does, and Phlox is like, oh, well, did you have sex with her? And he's like, no. And he's like, well, why not? I think you should. and they try to acknowledge that in this episode. T'Pol even says that, don't Denoblians have multiple partners? He's like, I know you're married, but you have multiple partners. And he's like, yeah, but that's true, but we work together. But here's the thing. That episode didn't just establish that Denoblians are polyamorous. It also established that they are very, very non-squeamish about sexual activity. In fact, they constantly, Phlox and his wife, made fun of humans for being so squeamish about sexual encounters. And like, oh, but now all of a sudden, this episode is saying that the humans are squeamish about their sexuality and they don't even like taking their clothes. So that's bullshit! And I don't think it was just that one episode with his wife. I think there's multiple episodes that reference Phlox with being very liberal. It's like, oh, you humans, you're so squeamish about sexuality, and now we're meant to believe they're even more squeamish than humans. That angers me. That is just so does not fit into anything. And to me, it's a lot worse when a singular show goes against its own continuity as opposed to like going against Star Trek canon or whatever. That's because, to be fair, it's like 50 years of this thing with tons and tons of different writers have been going for a long time. It's also impossible to be completely and totally true to it. I mean, you have to be true to it to a certain extent. Like, you can't say, for example, that the Borg were around, that the Federation knew about the Borg 20 years before the Borg were actually introduced to the Federation, or do something like that, Voyager. Like, that's no good. But for the most part, it's like all these minor nitpicky things people nitpick and get so pissed off about Discovery. Who cares? It's impossible to keep true canon. Absolutely true. But a show within its own canon, within its own character, a species that Enterprise made up, and a character Enterprise made up, and stuff that they just talked about like 8 episodes ago or 6 episodes ago, wasn't even that fucking long ago. They established this shit, and 6 episodes later, they said the exact fucking opposite. Alright. That's not the only reason why this episode or that side plot is terrible. It's also, it was just so dumb the way Paul breaks out and he, you know, Phlox keeps refusing to have sex with her, which I think goes against his character as established, because again, he wouldn't be taking advantage of her because she will die. Literally die. Now, I understand him looking for other solutions and maybe not wanting, she's not in the right state of mind, so I'll grant him that. But he would not be so squeamish about it as the way he comes off in this episode. And it's just so dumb. It's like this, so say the sex appeal thing when T'Pol's running around in her underwear and she's trying to have sex with Reed and talks about how much she wanted. Oh, I seen you looking at me. This sucks. This sucks. This is Enterprise at its absolute worst, in my opinion. So, no, my original thoughts about this episode being actually pretty decent were misleading. I wasn't remembering this episode correctly. Once I watched this episode, it is a bad, horrible episode. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is The Expanse. And not the awesome TV show, but the episode, which is the big finale for season 2. It sets up the season-long storyline in season 3. This is a good episode, but I wouldn't say it's a great one because it is not really self-contained. It's really just an introduction. It's almost like a trailer. It's like an hour-long trailer for season 3, basically. It's basically just setting. It's like a prologue. You could say that maybe that's a better way to put it. It's just setting up for what's going to happen in season 3, and I think it does a good job. To be fair, it does a really good job. It has the alien probe coming in and killing a shit ton of people on Earth, and Archer getting this news flash from Future Man. Like, that was really cool how the Suliban like surround them, but they actually want to help them because the future guy, he has his agenda, and if his agenda aligns with Archer, then he's not going to have any problem with helping him, which I thought was pretty cool. Now, if the future guy is a future Archer, and it does make sense why he wouldn't want Earth to be destroyed, but I don't buy that future Archer bullshit. But anyway, he's actually no one because the show never actually fucking revealed it. But anyway, yeah. So that part was really cool. But the episode had this also storyline about the Klingons like trying to kill Archer. Now, as I said, I liked that they continued that the Klingons didn't forget him, but I don't think it fit in this episode. I think they put it in this episode because there wasn't enough to this episode, and they knew it. They're like, oh, but there's no actual action or no like through story. We're just setting up for the Xindi story, so we need something for this episode. So let's just throw in Duras. And it's funny because all the scenes when Duras shows up to chase Archer, because he's always concerned about the Xindi. He heard all these people just died on Earth, and he's going on this huge mission to get the Xindi. And then when Duras shows up, he sees him as an annoyance. It's like, oh, leave me alone. I got better things to worry about than you. And that's how I feel as an audience member. I feel exactly the same way Archer does. That Duras is just annoying. He's just like an annoyance, just distracting from the main storyline. And it's just like, oh, go away. Who cares about you? And it's made worse by the fact that that's how Archer feels as well. So I'm feeling what Archer's feeling. It's like, oh, go away, Duras. And it's just obvious as like, it's like, oh, Duras, why do you keep coming now? And the reason why, Mr. Archer, is because the writers wanted to put more action in this episode. Blame them. So that was a bit contrived. But the way this episode did set up for the Xindi story arc, I thought was really intense. I do really love the 9/11 analogy. I think some people were against it. I disagree. I think Star Trek is at its best. Yeah, this is getting slightly off topic, but I've heard people complaining about Discovery that they were doing anti-Trump messages and saying that that's not Star Trek because Star Trek was doing, Cold War analogies. But that's because the original series came out during the Cold War. Star Trek has always done every iteration of Star Trek has done social commentary relevant to the time in which it came out. So, of course, like, I would be actually really pissed off if the current Star Trek show that came out now did not do anti-Trump commentary, because that's what's relevant. That's important. That's what's important to talk about in modern times. And so this and Enterprise came out around 9/11, so it was important for Enterprise to do 9. In fact, I thought in season 1, which is like pretty much right after 9/11, so some people might have saw this too soon, but in season 1 they did, the episode about the Suliban, how this one species persecuted all Suliban instead of just the Cabal. So that was commentary on how there was a lot of, hatred towards Muslims because of 9/11 when it was just one small terrorist group. So that was a good analogy, and I liked that episode, but it was kind of not really, it was kind of a cop-out because it didn't really confront the major issue about what happened with 9/11. So this episode finally does that, and I love that. I think it's a great analogy, and particularly what happens in season 3, and of course I'll get into that when I get into my coverage of season 3. I thought it was a perfect analogy for 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11. Maybe not perfect because no one's really coming to destroy America, where in this show the Xindi actually are coming to destroy Earth. But it was still really powerful analogy, like the having Trip lose his sister. Those scenes were very powerful in this episode, particularly when Reed tried to comfort him, and he was just like, why you keep talking about memorials? Who gives a shit? And how Trip's all attitude is like, we're not going there to talk about them. Talk to them. None of this non-interference crap that T'Pol's trying to ram down our throats. We're going there to kill them, right? And I love that. And Archer's just like, we're going to do what's necessary. So he wasn't as supercharged, but he was still pretty in the red, pretty angry about that. And it completely captures the atmosphere of the Americans were feeling after 9/11, and I love it. I think this is absolutely great. It was a very powerful episode, but as I said, it's not really self-contained. It's mostly just setting up the storyline, plus it had that annoying Duras thing. So I don't think it's the best episode ever. Oh, but I also want to talk about The Expanse, which is what the episode is about. I can't remember the name of The Expanse. Oh, fuck, I can't remember. But anyway, the one the Zendies are in, and then they set it up the storyline like Saval tells him not to go because it says it's too dangerous. So the Vulcan, they show like as images of the Vulcan's ship that was there, like all the Vulcans are killing each other. That felt very Event Horizon-esque to me. It felt a lot like Event Horizon, where if you ever seen that movie about the haunted spaceship that it like folded space and apparently went to hell when it was it's silly. But anyway, that movie starts with them getting an audio communication from the ship, and it was like all disturbing and people talking in Latin and like people ripping their eyes out. Oh, it was video as well. And people ripping their eyes out and doing shit like that. And you find out later in the movie that the Latin, what they're saying is save. Oh, they thought they were saying save me, but they found out halfway through the movie they're actually saying save yourself from hell, which I actually thought was effectively creepy. But anyway, this reminds me a lot of that they were going for that Event Horizon thing. And plus he talked about how the Expanse like inverted people, like a Klingon ship came out completely inverted. They never really addressed that in season 3, but they did address, like he talks about like all the weird spatial anomalies, and they did address that in season 3. And they also addressed the Vulcan ship as well, specifically, but I'll get to that when I get to that. But I thought it was, I don't know, I kind of liked it, but it reminded me too much of Event Horizon. I was like, that's very Event Horizon. But so it's like they were trying too hard to make it ominous, where I don't think they needed to try that hard to make the Expanse all ominous. I don't know if I really bought into it that much. Like, I think Saval, again, he's always obtuse. He was being obtuse, saying, ordering T'Pol not to go and telling Archer not to go was very obtuse, because it's the only possible way he can save the whole fucking planet. Of course he's gonna go. It's a bit stupid. But anyway, yeah. So that was another good episode of that I was talking about, but not one of the best of the show because it's just setting things up, but it's still a really good episode. Anyway, so those are all of the episodes of Season 2 of Enterprise. So now, let me get into the worst and the best episode of Season 2. So, just like Season 1, the worst episode contender list contains a shit ton of episodes, and the best episode contender list contains only 3. Yeah, that's Enterprise for you. Anyway, so the worst episodes, we got contenders like the 7th, the Communicator, Dawn, Bounty, A Night in Sickbay, Vanishing Point, First Flight. But the worst episode of Season 2 is definitely Precious Cargo. This is definitely one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. It was a poor idea. It was annoying. It had an actress who was not very good. It had dialogue that wasn't very well written. These two characters had no fucking chemistry. The romance made no sense. It didn't work. It was also a cliche type storyline. It's been done a billion times before. This had nothing new. It was like everything that you've seen before, but much worse. This is, and plus Trip wasn't, the woman who's like rich and pretty, she wasn't the only one that was annoying. Trip was annoying. You put two heavily annoying people together and have them go at each other. I would rather watch someone scratch their nails on the chalkboard for an hour than fucking watch this episode. I'd rather watch someone grind aluminum foil, or aluminium if you're British or Australian. I would rather watch someone chew aluminum foil for freaking an hour than watch this goddamn episode ever again. I fucking hope I never have to watch this episode again. Anyway, as for best episodes, as I said, only 3 contenders. We got The Expanse, as I just mentioned, and Regeneration. But the best episode of Season 2 is Cogenitor. As I said, this is what Seasons 1 and 2 should have been. The whole season should have had episodes like this, not just one episode out of 2 seasons. But hey, better than nothing, I guess. Great episode, great commentary, great acting. They actually use Trip correctly in this episode. They take advantage of the fact that he's such a moron, but they use it in a way that works for his character, works for the story, works for the commentary they have to say. This episode gives you a lot to think about without being heavy-handed. Either way, it's still, you can look at it in many different ways and have your own opinions and draw your own conclusions, but it shows you the consequences of cultural misunderstandings, and I think it's a very good, powerful episode. So, my rating for Star Trek Enterprise Season 2 out of 10 is a 1, the worst. Now, whenever I give a season of television a 10, I always have the caveat that no season is perfect. That even like some of the best seasons ever do have some weak spots. They do have some bad episodes, and it's not completely perfect, but it's a relative 10 because it means the best the season could be. Like, there's no such thing as a perfect season of television. And I would make that same caveat when giving a season of television a 1, because no season of television can be absolutely horrendous, horrible. There's bound to be some good parts in it as well, which is definitely the case with this season, because you have those 3 good episodes I just mentioned, Regeneration, The Expanse, and Cogenitor, and you have a lot of decent episodes that were okay, like Stigma, The Catwalk, Judgment. Like, those episodes were fine, but when the vast majority of the season is not good, when you have most of the episodes I would give a 1 or a 2, you have that one string of episodes that's all 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 7, 2, and then this season's not good. And plus, there's tons, if not just the 2s and 1s, there's also a lot of 5s and 6s. So if it's not being absolutely horrid, then it's just being mediocre. So it goes from mediocre to horrid to, oh, here's some good episodes, here's a great one, now it sucks again, and here's one other good one. That's basically it. So the majority of it was the writers weren't even trying. Like, every once in a while, maybe they get different writers in, or maybe for some reason they would try on these couple of episodes, but most of the episodes they weren't trying. This is a bland cast of characters, and they did nothing with this premise. They did shit just to do shit. They just ripped shit off or came up with cliche storylines that have been done a million times before, and for no reason, and so it's just simply not good. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Enterprise Season 2. I will be back in a month to finally, thank God, review a good season of Star Trek Enterprise. Oh, it's going to be so great. And yeah, I'll talk about Season 3 when I get there, but I'll just reiterate that the fact that Season 3 is better than the first 2 seasons is not an opinion. It's an objective truth that Season 3 is far superior to, and by any objective measure of what good storytelling, good television could be, Season 3 is far superior to the first 2 seasons. Anyway, I can't wait to talk about it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. And I'll see you guys. Be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos. And I cover many other videos on shows like The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.